This video is how I recap a Game Gear. I've done quite a few of these now, and this is the way that I find is the easiest and gives me the most success. It's probably not the quickest, but as I said, I've had the most success with this, so I thought I would share it. So this is a Game Gear that doesn't run. You've just seen me power it on, screen lights up, but you just get those lines across the screen. Generally, if the Game Gear won't boot to red light, or it's got vertical lines missing on the screen, then a recap probably won't fix that problem. But if you've got a Game Gear like this in that state where the red light did come on, and you got something on the screen, if the screen's duller than usual, I mean these screens weren't great back in the day, but if it's duller than what it should be, if you've got sound but no picture, or you've got picture and no sound, then it may fix it. So the first thing to do is get it open and have a look at it. Again, if there's any obvious signs of any battery leakage, then you're probably going to have other issues. But if you open it up and it looks fairly clean, then it's probably just these caps, these rubbish caps, the capacitors that Sega used, and they just need to be replaced. So remove all the screws. The screw at the top is a special fitting. I can't remember what type it's called, but you just need a special screwdriver for one screw at the top. The rest of them are just standard Phillips. There's two screws in the battery compartments as well, but they're usually fairly easy to take out. Just like any, I mean, I've not had too many problems with Game Gears, but like any old retro tech, just be wary that the plastic could be brittle. So just be very gentle when undoing the screws on that first turn. Sometimes you may want to give it a very small tighten before you unloosen it, but just don't be too heavy-handed, otherwise you risk breaking the pillars inside the Game Gear. So once the screws have been removed, the two halves can just lift apart. Remove the white connectors. Don't worry about removing the blue sides because they won't come out. So these two connectors here are on the soundboard, and there's another connector that I've just removed at the top of the screen. That's for the power board. I'd recommend that you use a tool to help remove the 2-pin connector on the soundboard. That's a little fragile. But once that's done, just move the power and soundboard to one side. So what I tend to do, as I've got another Game Gear, is I'll tend to work on the main board, and then I will test the main board with a known good power supply and soundboard, because if I can't get the main board working, then there's obviously no point in trying to sort out the power supply and the soundboard. Okay, so this is probably a little bit controversial, but the way that I take these capacitors, so these capacitors here, these are these black rectangles, the capacitors are inside them. For your motherboard, you know, the type of motherboard that you've got, go and have a look on the internet, find the specifications for your board, find out where the capacitors are, what rating that those capacitors need to be, because they are different depending on what board you've got. But the way that I tend to take them off is I, as you can see, use a small set of pliers and then very gently just wiggle them so they're glued down. So you just need to give a little bit of a sideways movement to break the glue, and then just wiggle them backwards and forwards, until basically the legs snap off. So what you tend to left with is on the board is you've got the solder connector with a small piece of leg in place. Now I've tried to do it with a soldering iron. I've tried to do it with hot air. But this, for me, is the least destructive way of doing it. The problem with the hot air is it could lead to melted plastic. if you're not ultra careful, you have the potential of blowing off other components on the board. But this way, for me, I have never damaged a track doing it this way. Yeah, as I said, I think this is the safest way to do it. It's certainly not the quickest way, because you'll see with the next steps you then got to go around and tidy it all off and get rid of the bits of the legs. But this is the approach that I still take on every Game Gear that I do. So you just go and find the schematics, learn where all the locations are, and go around and remove those capacitors. It's the same process for each one. Break the glue, so grab hold of the end opposite where the pads are, break the glue, and then wiggle it backwards and forwards until they come off. And then don't take much wiggling before they come off the board. So the next job is to clean the pads. It's on the pads that you've got left the small bits of metal from the legs. So use a fairly wide tip iron, because you want to get quite a bit of heat down here. I typically set the soldering iron to around 400 degrees. You can use a bit of flux if you want. Certainly if you're struggling to get the solder to melt. But I also tend to use a little bit of fresh solder as well. And I will just work away at the pad, melting the old solder, and then you can just see it there, just coming off the old bit of leg. So you just want to get rid of that old piece of capacitor leg, and then just running the iron backwards and forwards over the leg just to tide it over. And again, it's rinse and repeat. So on to the next spot where you remove the last, the other capacitors. Find the next one, apply the iron. If it doesn't come off, maybe apply a little bit of extra new solder and get the leg off. And then what you end up with is that little bit of leg stuck to the end of the soldering line. So just have whatever you use to clean your soldering iron to one side, and just keep wiping your soldering iron just to get rid of all those little bits of metal. And then just going over it and making sure that it's nice and clean and there's no residual bits of leg left. What I tend to do then is just go over the pads with a bit of solder wick, and just wick away that old solder, and basically any leakage that was there. Again, if you've got a little bit of solder on that solder wick, it helps just lay another nice layer of new fresh solder down onto those pads. You can get them quite flat, quite shiny, and a nice new surface to accept the new capacitors that you're going to put on. Once you've gone over it with the solder wick, just go over with a cotton bud and some IPA, and just make sure it's nice and clean, and really in a good place to accept some new solder. While you are cleaning each one, just have a little look around where the capacitor was, just in case there was any leakage, just in case there was any sign of corrosion on any of the components around it, and if there are, just give those a bit of a clean as well while you're there. I'm going to speed through this next bit, but it is pretty much rinse and repeat now. Again, just on this side of the board, just removing the legs, applying new solder if you need to get those legs out, going over it with the solder wick, and then cleaning it with IPA. And get to the top corner near the power supply connector. I tend to use the magnifying glass just to make sure that I don't nick any of the plastic, or because it's quite tight in there. So just as much light and as much magnification as you can to make your life easier. I use ceramic capacitors. Electrolytic through-hole capacitors are just a pain. You know, you've got to bend the legs, got to get them at the right angle. If you don't, then you're going to have problems closing the case. These things just are so much easier and just leave a lot neater job on the board. Again, magnification helps if your eyesight isn't brilliant. But just lock one end in, and then once you're happy with that, then lock the other end in as well. With the pads nice and clean, if you've got some good solder that's got flux in already, you don't necessarily have to lay any additional flux down. If the pads aren't particularly great because they were corroded and there's not a lot left, then by all means add a bit of additional flux to help that solder flow. The flux will give you a really nice bridge between the pad and the capacitor, but it just means a little bit of extra cleaning at the end. You can turn your iron down at this stage as well. So I said we had it at 400 degrees earlier to help remove that old solder and get those legs out. Now you've got those pads nice and clean, you don't need it to be that high. So I'll typically run it about 340 degrees Celsius here. And now just rinse and repeat. So I use the simplified capacitor diagrams on the internet. So I only use 3 values of capacitors on the main board. They are 100 microfarads, 10 microfarads, and 1 microfarad. Again, just the simplified model works. It gives just as good results as using the what the original spec capacitors were, and it just makes life a lot easier just having 3 values to work with. Just make sure you get the voltage ratings correct, and make sure you're following the correct guide for your Game Gear motherboard. As you're going along, again, just keep an eye on components around the capacitors, make sure they're all good. And if you're unsure of your connections that you're making, because some are just going to flow really nice, others may look a bit dodgy, then just get the multimeter out, go from the top of the capacitor, so the silver bit on the top of the capacitor, so you know you're actually taking a connection from the capacitor, not the solder joint. And then look for a sort of the next point on the board as to where that pad would connect to. So rather than trying to trace it to the bottom of the pad, go from the top of the capacitor to the sort of the next hop on the board, and then you know you've got a good connection from the capacitor all the way through the pad to the next point on the board. And then once you're done, nice clean with some IPA. And that's it. That is the main board done. So what I do at this stage is I pull out my half a Game Gear that's got a working power board and working soundboard on there, and I'll plug these into the main board that I've just worked on. Again, the big thick white connectors go on nice and easy, but just when you come to unplugging it, just be careful with that little 2-pin speaker cable that I've just plugged in there. Plug a game in, make sure that the game is the right way round. You don't want to kill your game at this stage, so just think about how it's orientated if you're not going to close it back up. tend to test it on mains power, just because it's easier than putting batteries in. And that's looking a good result. Brightness has turned down a bit, and the lights are a bit bright, but it does work. Works better than what it did originally. So that's all good. Motherboard is finished. So I'm going to move on to the power board next. This little black plastic piece is just stuck down, so that just needs to be pulled off, and then you can remove the 2 screws that hold the power board in place. Make sure you put the red power switch somewhere safe, preferably with all your screws, so that doesn't get lost. So on the power board there's 3 through-hole capacitors that need replacing. Now I never am able to do this very eloquently with the power board. I don't know why I struggle with this. I've tried a solder wick, I've tried my desoldering station, and I've tried a solder sucker, but some boards just give me more trouble than others, just to get them off cleanly. But perseverance, a bit of flux, and they do eventually come out. And then just make sure, like any capacitors, you're just putting them in with the right values and the right orientation. And that's it. That's the power board done, but don't plug that in yet, because we're going to test that later before we actually connect it to the Game Gear. And again, once done and the legs have been cut off, just don't forget to give it a good clean with some IPA. Now you can move on to the soundboard. You need to remove the metal shielding to get access to the soundboard. So just remove the screws for that, put it safe and the screws safe, and then remove the 2 screws on the soundboard to lift the soundboard free of the Game Gear case. Now the soundboard is typically one of the worst for leakage out of all the boards. Again, different ways of approaching this. I will tend to cut the capacitors off using snips. Since I've started doing it this way, I've had a lot less rework to have to do on the soundboards. So again, it's not the quickest way. Hot air is a bit quicker to do it, but there's a bit of plastic on the connectors around here that can easily get burnt, and it's not a huge amount of time doing it this way. But for me, cutting these off, it just gives me the best rate of success. So I'll use snips. I'll cut the big metal pillars above the sort of the plastic base bit. Just cut straight through them, nice and gently. You don't want to put any pressure on them on the pads, so you just sort of nipping away at it. Because I say you don't want to wiggle it. You don't want to put any pressure on those pads at all. So you're just cutting away the top. And then what you'll find then is with the top gone, you can lift off the remaining metal bit, then you can lift off the remaining plastic bit, and you're just left with 2 legs, very much like we were left with the 2 legs on the capacitors. And you've got to go around with the soldering iron, and again with fairly hot temperature, plenty of flux, and get rid of or flux or new solder, and get rid of those legs. And then get those pads nice and shiny and tidied up. All very much like cleaning the pads on the main board. Once all the prep work's done, it's time to add the new capacitors. I'll use ceramic capacitors again on the soundboard. Again, just because they're easy to work with and just have no space issues at all if you try and use electrolytic capacitors. Again, things can get a bit tight. We're trying to get the right angle on the legs, and again closing the case. So again, exactly the same process as the main board, and I will use all of the same type of capacitors on the soundboard. They're all 100 microfarad caps. So again, just keeping it nice and simple. So these boards are prone to being the worst damage, so if you do have any issues, the good thing about them is that they are fairly simple. They are fairly easy to trace where the line should go to. So if you have lifted any pads up, it's very easy just to run a wire to where the next step is. Other things on the soundboards, the volume control, so that variable resistor. If you have a problem where the sound crackles, if you spray some deoxit into that and then work that volume lever backwards and forwards, that will usually get rid of your crackle. And then very rarely you have problems with the actual headphone jack, but again, just worth a quick look in there just to make sure that that is nice and clean inside there. We can then reassemble the Game Gear, so put the power supply back in, put the soundboard back in, and then the next thing we're going to do is test the power board. The reason to that is just make sure the voltages are right, just in case there's a problem with it. What we don't want to do is put too much voltage onto the main board and cause any serious damage. Board disconnected, plug the power supply into the mains, and then you want to just get a multimeter and test the pinouts on the power supply connector. So they should look like this. So choose a ground and then just test the different voltages. 5 volts should be pretty much on the 5 volts. For the 1.28 volts and the 34 volts, and then you'll probably find the 9 volts reading a lot higher, about 12 or 13 volts, but that's fairly normal. Once you're confident the voltages are correct, you can unplug it from the power supply and then plug the power supply into the main board and the sound connector and the speaker connector into the sound card. And pop in a game. Again, make sure you get the orientation right and give it another test. And the last thing is to put it all back together. This time test it with batteries, make sure they work. And then that should be it, should be job done. And with those ceramic capacitors in, it should last for another 20 or 30 years. So that was my video on how to recap a Game Gear. As I said, it's not necessarily the fastest, that is the one that I have the most success with. You only need basic tools to do it, and if you take your time and obviously follow this video and other material on the internet, then you can do it with your Game Gear and ensure that it remains in good working order for the next few decades. Thank you for watching.